Hello, good morning. I'm Joanne Uy, the founder of EA Sustain and EA Festival, and I want to welcome you to day 2 of EA Sustain, which follows on the heels of a very successful day 1 yesterday. Today we have a jam-packed agenda that includes seaweed, food and farming, nature writing, Bhutan, education, and marine conservation. And I want to say that after yesterday, I was gratified to discover, or to see with my own eyes, the penny dropping in the minds of both the audience as well as the speakers, because I think in many situations, the speakers were generally speaking to specialist audiences. So I think that this is a festival which is the first of its kind because it really seeks to peel back the daily reality of the consumer to reveal things like food and farming, how the environment touches them every single minute of the day in ways that they don't consciously give any thought to. So on that note, I want to introduce our moderator, Louise Gray, who is going to interview Alastair Driver. Louise is actually an author in her own right and a journalist. I invited her to speak at the first EA Festival in 2021 because she's the author of a book called The Ethical Carnivore. And she's going to actually be coming out with a new book called Avocado Anxiety, which is launching next month, actually. She will actually be speaking at EA Festival this summer at Hedingham Castle, in case you want to sign up for that. And her books are on sale outside at Red Lion Books right outside the door. Alastair Driver, Professor Alastair Driver, is the director of Rewilding Britain and one of the nation's most eminent environmentalists, and actually has a clutch of incredible awards and accolades to his name. Besides having led Rewilding Britain since 2017, I'm just going to read these because these are so storied and dense. In 2022, he was named to the ENDS, the ENDS Power List of the top 100 UK environmental professionals who have made the greatest impact in the UK over the last 2 years. And as if that was not enough, he has also been the recipient of the world's largest environmental award, the International River Prize, on behalf of the Thames in 2010. I hope that during your conversation, you will have a chance to unpack that to Louise. But without further ado, please welcome both of them.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to open with possibly quite a cliche. Alastair, what is rewilding? Is it just wolves and bears?
You know the answer to that. Rewilding, I'll give you the tweetable definition, which I always give in my presentations. Rewilding is the large-scale, very important, large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature is allowed to take care of itself. That is the shortest definition I can give you, and it is then backed up by a whole series of principles which we will no doubt uncover in the discussion. But the things I want to emphasize are scale, size of area, and that will vary from country to country. We don't have the space for Yellowstones and Okavangos here, so different scale here, and we can talk about that in a bit. And then this business about getting to the point where nature is allowed to take care of itself. Let's be realistic. The chances of getting to that point in Britain at a very large scale are unlikely in my lifetime. I'm not a spring chicken, as you can tell, but it ain't going to happen in my lifetime. But we should think about it as a spectrum, a journey towards that destination. And my role is partly to encourage people to be moving up that spectrum where appropriate. If we get to that point, nature is totally taking care of itself at scale. Actually, we've rewilded. It's not rewilding anymore. Rewilding is a present participle. It takes you in that direction. And if you get to that point, you've rewilded.
That fills me with hope that there's a spectrum, because it feels like, we can start small and get bigger. And I think it probably changes some people's perspective of rewilding, because they thought it was just, a land in Scotland or in quite wild land. But just gives an idea of where it started. I guess I was first aware of it with Feral, George Monbiot's book, about a decade ago. Where did it start in Britain or in the conservation circles? Is it an old idea or is it relatively new?
It's basically has been going on for a very long time.
Yeah.
For example, I used to be head of conservation for the Environment Agency, and I worked in public service for 34 years. And in that role, I had the privilege of literally delivering thousands of projects. And we always tried to be bigger and more hands-off with our wetland projects, but often we still needed to be managing them, and they actually weren't that big. They were just a few hundred acres here and there. So we were kind of already doing it, but it didn't have the name Rewilding. I guess George Monbiot really brought it to public consciousness when he did with Feral. Rewilding Britain was set up about 7 years ago. I joined 6 years ago, having decided I'd done what I could in the Environment Agency. It was time for a new challenge. What was really interesting is when I first started in this role, everyone was saying, "Oh, you can't use that word. You can't use the R word. It's too scary. It's toxic." Now we're in a position where the world and his wife is using the word for everything from, 100,000 hectares of rewilding in Scotland to stopping mowing a roundabout. And actually the challenge now has gone for me from getting people to be not so frightened of using the word where appropriate, to actually making sure that people remember actually what it is and that it is different to traditional nature conservation. And I can say this, I'm a traditional nature conservationist. I've been doing this for 45 years, and I still do it in my spare time. But it's different. Rewilding is different. It has a different outcome. It has a different journey towards the environmental outcomes.
And why do you think I think people are still scared of the word.
Some are, yeah.
And it's still stopping projects. Why do you think people are scared of the term rewilding?
There's a mix of reasons. Partly, they don't truly understand what it means, and they still think it's wolves and bears and land abandonment, even though we now have, at Rewilding Britain, we have a rewilding network that we've set up, and there are over 70 case studies on that network. None of them have got wolves and bears, because there aren't any in this country. None of them involve land abandonment. Yeah. They all involve actually delivering of multiple benefits, not just wildlife and nature, but also better flood risk, better water quality, carbon sequestration, jobs, very importantly. Jobs have gone up. I've got data on all this, which we can talk about. Volunteer engagement's gone up. So they don't realise that actually it's a win-win-win-win-win,
Yeah.
And so that's one reason. And then the other reason is being afraid of change and not wanting to even contemplate embracing it as a possibility in certain places. And that's a more blinkered approach, and that's a human nature thing.
So if you were going to describe it to people to try and encourage them, we can't talk about maybe possibly lynx and beaver, but other than that, what does it look like when rewilding happens, and what species can we see in the British land?
Well, I'll give you some examples. So part of my role, if I can just explain my role, it's partly to travel the country advising landowners on rewilding where they want advice. And by the way, it's not just private landowners. They're only about 25% by area. There's another 75% that is either farms, either water company land or government-owned land, Forestry Commission, MOD, potentially Crown Estate, and then private businesses and individuals. So there's a whole mix of landowners. And the other part of my job is to influence policy at as high a level as I can. And as I travel the country, I'm invited in. Usually the way it works is, we've heard about you and what you're doing. Could you come and tell us, is rewilding appropriate here? And the best way for me to show them what it might be is to show them images. So we use artists' impressions a lot to demonstrate how a land can become more natural. And the number one thing to bear in mind is rewilding is about allowing natural processes to prevail. Now, that's a bit of a techie phrase, but I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. If you take rivers and river processes, natural processes in a river system means the river is totally naturally connected to its floodplain, so it floods when it should. It has a natural not always sinuous, but a natural channel that is unimpeded by dams, for example, and weirs and structures. There is no pollution in the catchment, so no input of sewage or agricultural runoff, etc., chemicals, etc. It is that if all of those things are prevailing, then a river will be in a natural process recovery system. Now, the number one principle for all rewilding sites is that you must be allowing natural regeneration of vegetation. And this is where it branches away from traditional conservation. Because with both rewilding and traditional conservation, in this country, because we've had 200 or more years of impact by man in a densely populated country, there's quite a lot to do to remedy the recovery, to enable that recovery. That means intervention. We could sit back and wait hundreds of years, but we haven't got time. We've got a biodiversity crisis and we've got a climate emergency. So we must be intervening to kickstart that recovery. And so with conservation and rewilding, you intervene a lot. This is a sort of activity graph. You intervene a lot to start with. And then with conservation, you continue to manage your vegetation and habitats, etc., and water in a particular way to maintain particular habitats that you want from that land and water. But with rewilding, yes, you might intervene to the same extent, but then you tail off over time. You're gradually moving towards nature looking after itself. So your investment, etc., reduces over time. So allowing natural regeneration of vegetation is a given. And that means scrub. And of course, one of the things is we then have to start encouraging people to love scrub, scrub and thorn and thicket and bramble and all that mess. We need to move away from this tidiness mentality. And so, yes, it looks scruffy, but to us nerdy ecologists, it looks amazing. You can look at a landscape like that, and straight away you're going to see certain things there that wouldn't otherwise be.
I think people might change in their mindset, that people might understand, that scrubby mess over by the railway line is actually a thing of beauty. Rather,
I know they will, because it's already happening. All of these rewilding landowners, it's a privilege to be working with them, because they're all positive. They're all enthusiastic. They've come to us wanting to hear of the benefits and how they might do it. So it is a slightly biased sector of society that I'm dealing with. They're people who are open-minded, but they've read Wilding, and they've read other eminent books that have come out in recent years. Some of them have been to NEP and been inspired by it, so they get it.
You mentioned NEP, which is an estate down in Sussex, which is rewilded and brought back wild horses and pigs, but that's also an estate with a castle. Do you need to be a big landowner with a castle to rewild?
No, not at all, no. We have everything from small, medium-scale farms through to big private estates, through, as I said, to MOD rifle ranges, Forestry Commission land, water company, upper catchment areas. There's a whole mix. Literally any type of owner could, in theory, rewild if they had enough land.
Does that include the individual? Because lots of people into rewilding might want to know what they can do.
Okay, so then you come back to the spectrum. We this last year, Rewilding Britain decided to create a rewilding garden for Chelsea, RHS Chelsea. And we got some fantastic designers in, and we wanted to demonstrate the value of nature and the beauty of nature at a very small scale. We also chose to demonstrate the value of beavers, so we created an artificial beaver lodge and dam and a stream running through. And we were blown away by the fact that we won Best in Show at Chelsea and a gold medal, because it really captured the public's imagination.
Did the royals come and see it?
No, well, I'll tell you a story about that. The Queen was doing a tour of the site like she does. And she was due to come and see the Best in Show, like she would. And she was veered away from it. She was steered away from it at the last minute. So that's an interesting thing to bear in mind. That there you have. Oh, no, ma'am, I don't think you want to be looking at that. It's a bit of a mess.
You think,
Sad, but true.
Well, maybe you'll get the next generation of royals to
Yeah, I think
at the
William,
Beaver Dam next time.
William, if you're out there, I'd like to have a chat.
I'm sure he'll be listening to the recorded version, certainly. But I love the idea of the spectrum that we can do it in our own gardens.
Yeah, I've done it in my garden. I've got a
Yeah.
garden no bigger,
Just nettles and
no
brambles
bigger than
in your
this
garden.
area here, and I've
Yeah.
got a little patch with a pond, a wildlife pond, running the roof drainage off my roof, running the drainage off my roof. I've got newts, I've got frogs, I've got about 20 species of dragonfly and damselfly. And when the grandkids come round, they absolutely love it. I've got a little wildflower meadow. It's all pocket stuff, and it's right at the bottom end of the rewilding spectrum. But if you imagine lots of people in a street started doing that, and they had connectivity between their fences for things that can't fly, actually, you are moving in the rewilding direction.
There are two things there. Like, first of all, the management. You talked about the spectrum and trying to get to a sort of rewilding plateau where you can leave nature. But aren't we always, like, I'm thinking of rhododendrons in Scotland, aren't we always going to have to keep on interfering to ensure that
Yes.
there's...
In some case,
Yeah.
yes, in some circumstances, you absolutely will. And the classic example of an intervention that you will continually have to manage, certainly in my lifetime, is the management of large herbivores.
Right.
We need, so this takes us to
Venison.
the bit. Oh, well, and cattle, actually. In England, I cover England and Wales.
Yeah.
The organisation covers Britain, but I cover England and Wales. And in England and Wales, virtually every single rewilding site has small numbers of rare breed cattle, sometimes pigs, sometimes ponies, roaming over very big areas. And the reason for that is one of the natural processes that would normally exist is herbivory, big grazing animals. Bison, elk, beaver, and boar, for example, in Europe, big grazing animals impacting on the vegetation, creating a variety of and a mosaic of vegetation types. That would be what happens naturally. We don't have those things in most cases. We don't have the ancient aurochs, which was our ancient cattle, which used to do this. So we, in order to try to get as close as we can to that process of interaction between herbivores and vegetation and soil and water, we introduce small numbers of rare breed cattle, or pigs, or ponies.
Or oryx, is there...
Aurochs is an ancient cattle that doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yeah.
Isn't there work to try and, like, do Jurassic Park and try
Yeah, well,
and
that's a subject for another day. I'm
Oh, okay,
not particularly
fine,
keen
fine.
on. I'm not really keen on that idea because
okay.
who knows where it could end, you know.
Could be really cool.
Yeah, but well, I'll leave that with you, all right?
Okay. But you also talked about connectivity there. Do you want to expand on that, on the idea that, you know, it's a lovely idea that we all have these patches, but actually they're not worth anything unless the animals can move, right?
Yeah, well, first of all, as I say, rewilding is at scale, and just to give you a feel for what I mean by large scale, actually, it's not that big. I will visit sites for 250 acres upwards. So that's not very big. That's a small, medium-scale farm.
Okay.
But ideally, we would be working at thousands of acres. And there are quite a lot that are doing that, but they're mainly in the uplands. But, sorry, I forgot the...
It's about the connectivity.
Sorry.
The idea that, I think if we take your garden, for example, you know, there are animals there, but those animals probably need to move, don't they?
Yeah, things like hedgehogs. That's what I talked about, you know, removing
on that
barriers.
small scale.
Yeah, even at a small scale.
Yeah.
But connectivity in rewilding is very important. And I just want to put our ambition into perspective. So Rewilding Britain's got an ambition to rewild 5% of the country. That's just over 1 million.
Where are we at the moment?
We're including Scotland, we're at about 1%. That would tick the boxes for moving, you know, quite a way up the rewilding spectrum.
Okay.
It's about 1% nationally.
Yeah.
In England, it's about 0.3%.
Okay.
So, and Wales, it's virtually zero. So we got a long way to go, but we are saying that we would like to see 5% rewilding buffered by and connected to another 25% of nature-friendly farming land uses and nature reserves, etc. The sort of stuff that Jake does and others do to great effect. So it's 5%, 25%. That gives you the 30% that all these governments are blithely saying they're going to aspire to by 2030,
target.
which is a massive, massive challenge.
Okay.
But, you know, that's how it fits in. And if we had that, I firmly believe that we would, A, turn things around on wildlife and nature recovery, and B, significantly mitigate the impacts of climate change.
That's interesting because there's a government target to have 30% wild land by 2030.
Yeah, land in nature recovery, yeah.
But I'd always understood that as 30% rewilded, but you're saying actually...
That's the more loose term.
So...
Loose use of the word rewilding.
Yeah, actually the 30% includes nature-friendly farming?
Very high-end nature-friendly
Well,
farming,
yeah.
which we should be aspiring to in plenty of places. Higher-level, good higher-level stewardship. Nature reserves, which are managed. They're not rewilding because they're managed in a particular state, but they're great for biodiversity. But if you look, and Tony Juniper yesterday touched on this, if you look at even our national parks, most of them wouldn't qualify. Most of the areas within them wouldn't qualify.
And why is that? Because they're reserves and they're not...
No, it's because most of our national parks actually are not nature reserves. They are farmland and grouse-moor.
Right.
So they're not actually necessarily achieving their biodiversity potential.
But would they be in the 30% in that they are...
No.
Nature... Why? Okay, that's...
They shouldn't be.
Well,
it wouldn't surprise me if the government tries to sort of lump all that in there and say, oh, that's done. Well, it's not done. In fact, I can point virtually every single rewilding site I'm dealing with, even in year 2 or 3, is ecologically better than most of our national park land.
So some high-value nature-friendly farming, you'd consider more wild, better for nature than some of our national parks.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And there are some of those within our national parks.
Yeah.
And there's some rewilding areas in our national parks.
Yeah.
But they are still a relatively small percentage.
Yeah. I actually find it to think of 30 by 30, including a bit of farming, I actually find a bit quite heartening because it means that that actually sounds more doable. Yeah. In fact. And it brings me on to my next question about food, because obviously if we're going to have all that land dedicated to wild areas, what are we going to eat?
Yep. So, a couple of things. First of all, we're doing a mapping exercise at Rewilding Britain at the moment, which can demonstrate quite clearly that you can achieve 5% rewilding without touching productive farmland. Just grade 4 and 5 farmland and woodland. We can achieve that without touching genuinely productive farmland. Don't forget, grade 4 and 5 land a lot of it is still farmed, but it's not what you'd call productive because you have to pile, huge amounts of inputs in it just to break even. And then you have to remember that we waste 40% of the food we produce to eat. 40%. That is millions of tons of food every year. All that effort by the farmers, all that carbon, all that water, all that investment, blood, sweat and tears, down the drain. So that's the first thing to say, is actually, A, we can do it without impacting on production. Yeah. B, we waste 40% of the food we produce to eat. If we're serious about that, we need to sort out distribution, pricing and waste. Those 3 things need to be sorted by government. And then there's the point that actually, don't forget, these sites have got cattle, a few rare breed cattle, a few rare breed pigs on the land and deer. Yeah. And those animals, in the absence of wolves and bears and lynx, which would be naturally managing these populations, in the absence of those, we are the wolf, we are the lynx, we are the bear. And if you're going to act as that, you can either chuck them in a pit in the ground, or you can actually harvest them and eat high quality meat. And that's what everybody does. So just to finish that, I've got the data on 50 rewilding sites in England that shows that in total, these sites produce 54%, so roughly half of the livestock units. It's a way of measuring meat, if you like. 54% of the livestock units they produced before they were rewilding, when they were farmed. Yeah. So it's about half. Yeah. So it's basically half of NAFall.
So it wouldn't make much impact for those. You're arguing that 5% to be rewilded, but sheep farmers in Wales might see it differently.
They do.
How are you tackling that clash?
Yeah. Okay, so the general trend for all these sites that I've got the data for is that they move from large numbers of sheep for prolonged periods in the same area to small numbers of cattle roaming over bigger areas. That's the trend. And the sheep numbers are 6% of what they were before. The cattle have actually increased. The cattle numbers have gone up slightly overall. So sheep, large numbers of sheep, prolonged periods, same area, that is an anathema for rewilding. So we have to accept that, okay? But I've worked out, if you rewilded 5% of Britain, based on the reductions we've seen on these 50 sites, if you extrapolated that across to 5%, we would move from 34 million sheep in this country to 33 million. And if you look at food habits, eating habits, sheep, meat eating, and particularly lamb, is declining. It's going up in cost, but it's declining in quantity. So we could achieve that easily without significant impact. However, there is a problem in certain parts of the country with even having a conversation.
Yeah, the rewilding.
Even having a rewilding conversation, the R word. And so the simple truth is, we don't go there. Okay. We have got so much of the country where people are putting their hands up. Can you come and talk to me?
Yeah.
Can we have a conversation? I'm not sure I want it, but I'd like to know more about it. Well, we do not need to go challenging those people who don't want to engage. We've got such a backlog to where the door is half open.
Yeah.
That's what we focus on.
And we'll maybe see that change anyway, I guess.
Yeah, it will gradually come through government policy.
Yeah. All through conversations like this, and conversations you're having.
Yeah, that will make a bit, just to clarify that will make a bit of a difference, because it already is.
Yeah.
And demonstrating that you can do great things like Knapp and Ennerdale and Haweswater and Ken Hill. Yeah. Yes, that helps. Yeah. But to make the step change we need, and I mean a tenfold increase in activity, you have to convince government to change policy and funding. And that's what people like me are trying to do with this future farming scheme.
And that will be about subsidies and how to encourage farmers to do payments. I mean, that 5% is really interesting, but I suppose most of the country in farming is something different. So can you explain how rewilding happens in more productive farmland in the kind of places like East Anglia?
Well, I haven't got many examples, to be honest. There's very few. It just, most landowners are deliberately choosing to consider it because their farmland is non-productive and they're having to spend so much money on inputs and labour that, they're thinking there must be a better way.
But can it be mixed in with, productive farming? What does that look like? Because, like I said at the beginning, people are imagining rewilding as wild mountains. But if we're going to see it in our gardens, but how are we going to see it in our food that's produced on productive farms? Is it about hedges, ditches? What does it look like?
Well, certainly it can sit side by side as long as you have that connectivity through the landscape, that physical connectivity. So I'll give you an example of the place that I've been staying at with Nicholas and Charlotte. It's a perfect example. It's a very productive farm, very productive, and he's getting 13 tons a hectare of wheat in some of the fields. Amazing, good high quality production. But he's also got fantastic wild pockets in that landscape. And we just had the conversation this morning, that those wild pockets, they are sort of well on the rewilding journey, but they're not big connected areas. So if, for example, I go to a landowner like that, I would encourage them to start to join those areas up and have bigger blocks of rewilding. Yeah. But I would also encourage them to significantly improve the corridors of connectivity through the landscape, hedgerows, the watercourse, much fatter. I mean, these, some of these hedges that I see around the country are skeletal. Yeah. Particularly in parts of Cumbria, for example, and indeed here. They're not hedged, they're just a fence, and they're not really serving that purpose for wildlife. So thickening them up, allowing them to be much, much wider. And this again comes back to the farming subsidy scheme and people being incentivised and not penalised for losing the production area next to the hedge that they're moving their hedge into.
But I believe that is a productive farm and a farm that's absorbing carbon and non-organic. So it's
they're net. Yeah. They're net negative on carbon. They're a net sequester of carbon, which is fantastic. Yeah. And that's partly because they have things like cricket-back willows, etc. Yeah. And it gets a bit complicated and technical. But he is not a farmer that I would go and say you should be rewilding.
Right.
Yes, you could rewild pockets and make
Yeah.
them slightly better
Yeah,
connected.
yeah.
But I wouldn't expect to be going to trying to persuade someone like that who's getting 13 tons per hectare of wheat out of it.
So who are you focusing on?
It's all of those who are realizing that, like NEP, they're on heavy clay, for example. They're slaving their guts out to make it pay. And I'll just give you some finance figures, economics on that. NEP, before they were rewilding, about 20 years ago, were basically producing a mix. They had a mix of arable and some cattle. And they just couldn't make it work. Some years they weren't making a profit at all, and they have quite a bit. It's typical of the private landowners. They've got quite expensive assets they need to maintain. A very expensive house and cottages around the estate and outbuildings, etc. It's expensive, and you need plenty of cash. And it wasn't paying enough to things. It just wasn't working. So last year, and Charlie is happy to talk about this in public. Last year, on what they call the nature tourism offer, which is basically the rewilding part of the estate, and they're not rewilding the whole estate, it's only part of the estate. On that offer, which is camping, glamping, safaris, and high-quality meat from the animals that are in that rewilding area, they turned over £1 million last year. They made about £300,000 profit. Okay. That's 20 times the income they were making from the entire estate pre-rewilding. So it's not just for nature and climate mitigation. It's also a serious option economically for some
would there be
landowners.
More jobs there as well?
Overall, the jobs have gone up 65% on rewilding sites. For the 50 sites I got data for, a year ago, 65% increase in jobs, FTE, full-time equivalents. Just about to go out this year to get the same data, and I know it's going to be more than that because I know sites have recruited more people. Volunteer engagement's gone up tenfold.
Yeah.
With all the health and well-being benefits that go with that.
And people can get quite excited about that because they can eat the wild meat. But is there a way they could engage on the more general aspects of rewilding, either through understanding and supporting government in the subsidies or through the food they eat? Is there another way of supporting rewilding if you want to see more of it happening in the UK?
Do you mean for the landowners or?
I mean for the general public.
For the general public?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, is what they can do in their little patch, themselves to help move in that direction. Secondly, there's getting involved in community activity. And what we're starting to see is, particularly in Scotland, is communities getting together and actually buying land. There's the Langholm initiative where the community got together and raised millions of pounds to buy a grouse estate, which is amazing. Yeah. Haven't seen that yet, as far as I know, in England, but it probably will happen.
There isn't the government policy to back it up in the same way.
Not in the same way, no. And the other way is through volunteer engagement in these sites. So, as I say, the volunteers have gone up tenfold. There are now something like over 1,000 volunteers engaged in the sites that I deal with, and that figure is only going in one direction. And they're doing all sorts of things: maybe tree planting, maybe just collecting litter, maybe recording wildlife, running nature tours, educational activity, health and well-being activity. All of these things are spin-offs from this kind of activity.
It's great to hear, and I'd like to, we were talking about the species coming back, but I love that line, you saying, we are the wolf. There's a great hashtag to that.
Be the wolf.
Yeah, exactly. If you really want to see the herbivores move. And
we'll have to, until some glorious day when things have changed. But I can see
the venison and the wild meat and things like that.
We will see lynx back in this country, possibly in my lifetime. I'm pretty confident about that.
In England? Rather
potentially in northern England, Scotland.
But we'll never see the actual lynx, will we? Because they'll be hiding.
They're so secretive. I gave a talk once.
Shame.
Time for Q&A.
We'll do it. Has anyone got any questions for Alastair? The lady in the middle with the glasses. Okay. You on the links, where are they?
Yeah, so I chaired a session like this actually with a lynx expert from Switzerland. He lived for 10 years in lynx territory filming lynx. That was his thing. He's a well-known expert. And he told me he'd seen lynx 3 times.
Yeah.
3 individual occasions. All his footage was from remote cameras. They are so shy and secretive. They live in and around woodland edges. And yes, you probably wouldn't get to see one most of the time, but just for me, as a naturalist, just knowing it's there and maybe finding droppings or tracks or, oh, is that one I just saw? Just that thrill is something that people would definitely be prepared.
Are there other
to pay for.
species that we don't know about, like maybe some insects or plants that that we could see in rewilding, which might be easier?
I've got a list of all the reintroductions on rewilding projects.
Yeah.
The list is 47 species so far.
Okay.
That they've either introduced or planning to,
Yeah.
and they include invertebrates,
Yeah.
plants, even mycorrhizal fungi. Even
Are
the
there
fungi
any that we might
lives-
see in East Anglia anytime soon, other than the white-tailed eagle in Norfolk? Eventually.
Well, you're going to obviously the beavers in enclosures.
Yeah,
you know that.
yeah.
White-tailed eagles, we will sooner or later get there on white-tailed
Yeah,
eagles,
yeah.
white stork potentially. But we're also looking at, it's not just the things that are absent, it's
Yeah.
things that populations are so scattered and fragmented, like red squirrel and water vole.
Yeah.
There are projects now, particularly red squirrel, where you've already introduced pine marten, or pine martens are naturally there.
Yeah.
Pine martens tend to control grey squirrels, and that allows a bit of a bounce back for red squirrels. So following on pine marten reintroduction with red squirrel reintroduction a few years later is a possibility.
Any other questions?
Lots.
Gentleman on the third row up. You just look behind you. Yes.
Are there any government-backed or sort of DEFRA help for someone, a landowner wanted to rewild part of his farm? Would that qualify for any government grants?
At the moment, are you such a landowner, sir? No. All right. But at the moment, landowners like that are negotiating stewardship arrangements with their Natural England advisors, etc. And some of them are able to access funding to move in the rewilding direction without breaking the rules of stewardship. So yes, that is happening. And one particular way that works very neatly with rewilding is the creation of what we call wood pasture, which is basically grassland with scattered trees which will be lightly grazed by extensive cattle. That is moving in a rewilding direction. And that's actually quite a decent payment, that people can get up to around £500 per hectare. So there are a few, but there's nowhere near enough money in the pot to satisfy the demand.
And do you think the government would ever call that rewilding? Do you think they'd ever have the guts to say taxpayers' money is going towards rewilding?
Yeah, no, not yet.
No.
They will, because I will
so?
I will take them down. But I took Rebecca Pow around an estate that I advised privately, and she's the minister, and she said, "Yes, it's great, but we're not going to call it rewilding." And I said,
Well, who cares what it's called if she's doing it?
That's fine, Rebecca, but let me tell you, this word is here to stay. It's got a clear definition. It's got a clear set of principles. It's not going anywhere. So the sooner you embrace it, the sooner we can move on.
I had a lovely term recently, because I think rewilding, I don't think it matters what it's called. Obviously, you're rewilding Britain, but they called it wild farming instead,
Yeah.
It can be called anything.
Oh, I don't mind. I don't
as long as it
really
does the
mind,
job.
as long as they're moving in the direction. Because
Yeah.
the more people that move in that direction, the more more places you can show people. That's rewilding in Britain at this point in time. That's rewilding. What do you not like about it?
And then there's carbon sequestration and diversity, which is
Flood
two things that
management,
we
all
need.
this stuff, all these
Ecosystem
benefits.
Another question. The lady with the blonde hair in the middle. Yes, you're looking at it.
Thank you. Farmers and landowners already rely so heavily on government subsidies. You've got elms, things like that. Surely there's got to be a business case for rewilding away from that reliance, especially for the kind of younger generation coming into it.
No, I absolutely agree. And the way that this can go is that we will, and I think it will go this way, is that we will start to bring more private money into nature conservation and nature recovery, rewilding, etc. And it's starting to happen. I'll give you some examples. So you've got biodiversity net gain, which is through the planning system where developers contribute to a pot to do good things. It's entirely feasible that you could have rewilding projects funded through that mechanism. They need to change the way they measure this because it's very prescriptive at the moment. You know, you have to create 6 hectares of this type of grassland or 3 hectares of this type of woodland. That's not what rewilding is about. It's about relaxing and seeing what comes. But biodiversity net gain through the planning process is one way that private money can come in. Secondly, biodiversity offsetting. Now, it's not compulsory at the moment. People are doing it by choice in some places, but businesses are deciding we would like to not just offset our carbon footprint, but offset our entire ecological footprint. And so that is starting to happen. And then you have nutrient offsetting, where there are significant pollution issues in river catchments and estuaries, etc., where again the causes of that pollution are chipping into a pot. And I give you an example on the Isle of Wight, for example, and in Dorset, sites have been bought by the Wildlife Trust for rewilding using nutrient offsetting money. Because you know the moment you start rewilding, there are no inputs, no chemicals, no fertilizers going onto that land. And it was formerly farmland where lots of that was happening. So, and then there's the private philanthropic investment. We get quite a lot of that. I could not believe it. Coming from the Environment Agency, where I was always scrabbling around for money for conservation, to suddenly be receiving emails. Professor Driver, I've got a couple of £1 million I need to just unleash. Have you got any ideas for rewilding? And they're serious. So I am connecting them with charities like the Wildlife Trust directly. We're just acting as a broker, quickly passing them on to reliable deliverers. And it's quite interesting. That's happening quite regularly.
I'm sure they're being philanthropic, but are they also being quite wise? If carbon offsetting and biodiversity offsetting happens, then they're also going to have something potentially quite valuable that they can...
Yeah, some of them think like that.
Yeah.
Some of them just want to do it because they've got too much money.
And do you think we might see a trickle down that would be quite interesting for the everyday consumer if say Pepsi Cola is biodiversity offsetting? You could pick up a packet of crisps that says, this is I don't know, like rewilding credits, or like you see on cereals, or like
red tractor stuff and all
that. Like a sort of,
well, that's fraught with challenges and actual genuine
offsetting's a bit dangerous.
I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of that.
Okay.
But if it leads to genuine nature recovery, and by the way, carbon offsetting, I tend to stay away from altogether because it's fraught with difficulties. There's a lot of cowboys out there, and just buying up half of Wales and planting it with Sitka, that's not doing
so
any good for biodiversity. That's not rewilding.
Biodiversity offsetting is different. It's not really offsetting. It's more.
It's multi-benefit.
Yeah.
Multi-benefit.
But it's still money in the pot for the farmer who does it, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions? Charles, waving a hand.
I knew it was gonna come.
Is this working? Yes. Sorry, I probably better say who I am. I'm Charles Clover, and I'm speaking later, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. But, Alastair, an edit and a question. The edit is that you say that you don't see the possibility of large-scale rewilding in Britain in your lifetime. It's already happening in the sea.
Sorry, just to qualify that. I don't think I specifically said that, but I meant large-scale with perfectly intact ecosystems, and I did. You're right. I was referring to land, and we have got marine rewilding sites on the network, and I was remiss not to mention marine sites. And actually, the scope for marine rewilding is Charles is inferring, is way beyond what's possible on land. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
I mean, the definitions we can all talk about, but the Dogger Bank was protected last June as a result of our legal pressure, our charity. And it is the size of Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
It's got a few wind farms, but it's now got trawling and dredging banned. Maybe more things ought to happen. I mean, I say this simply because, and here's the question, why is it so difficult to get the establishment to see the benefits of this? I mean, you've talked about the Queen. I thought that's rather good. I have felt the same pushback from the royal estates. Why is it so difficult to get the establishment to recognise the benefits of rewilding? With a current example, in the sea, we have before us a proposal for highly protected marine areas. These are rewilded areas, right before government for decision this month, and they're already pulling Lindisfarne out of it, and there will be then 4 out of, instead of 5, and this is. And even when we had Lindisfarne in the list of proposed sites, it was 0.05 or something of England's waters. Yeah. I mean, it is an ambition on a staggeringly small scale, given that you're contending with an industry, the fishing industry, which has a turnover the size of Harrods.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of reasons that I would emphasise. First of all, there is still a strong lobby from some of the farming community against it, and that has traction in the corridors of power. But most of that lobbying is based on myths around rewilding. And the second, and I had a recent example, is government just, excuse the phrase, but they just don't have the balls to make the right decisions when it comes to the crunch. And I'll give you the example. I can't say where it is because it's confidential, but I went to a nationally significant infrastructure project to advise, because they wanted to hear whether I thought if they had to acquire land for this approved project, could they actually then rewild that land and basically get net gain on that site and actually have some in the bank for other nationally significant projects. It was a golden opportunity. The landowners were up for it. The scheme was already approved, so it was going to happen anyway, and the ministers just turned it down because obviously he decided they didn't want to spend that extra money in it. Presumably they were worried it would set a precedent. But actually the whole purpose should have been to set a precedent for future projects, because if we're going to make this step change towards nature recovery and climate mitigation, we've got to make really brave decisions. And sadly, when it comes to the crunch, they cannot.
If you are interested in rewilding the oceans, there's an excellent session at midday with Charles about the huge potential on our shores. I think I probably have to wrap. I have 1 minute left. Quick question. That the lady to the right.
I'll be very quick. It was almost an answer to Charles's question. I read an article which was actually tweeted by Chris Packham in terms of why aren't government doing, embracing things, and it turned out that individual MPs were being funded by, chemical companies, and if they're funding individual MPs and you follow the money and see where that money is coming from, they're going to make decisions about farming subsidies and the direction in which they're going.
I did want to ask a question when you referred to there is lobbying against rewilding. My ears pricked on that as well. I thought perhaps you can tell us in private afterwards. We better wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Alastair. It's been a real eye-opener. We are the wolves.
Thank you.